Sordo. I'm based in Practical Action. I'm working in Practical Action in the UK as the Energy Access Partnership and Innovation Manager. And I have the pleasure to be your facilitator today for the webinar on productive uses of electricity in rural populations, which is going to showcase the experiences and challenges based on a long-term experience produced by Practical Action in the context of rural Peru for over the last 4 or 5 years. So I'm gonna try to be quick before presenting our our panelists today in the webinar. Uh, I just want to introduce why and why we created this webinar today, and the main reason why we did this is this webinar is basically the third webinar out of a series of 3 webinars that we in Practical Action have created in the region of for internal purposes, but we decided to open this up for external audiences today, specifically because we are on the way to formally organize a regional event in Peru that is going to take place by the 11th and 12th of June this year. And the event is looking at talking about or discussing the topic of rural energy and the contribution under the NDCs of the Paris Agreement. So what's the role of energy access, cooking and electricity under the Paris Agreement? And we are going to count with many different speakers, not just at the regional level, but also speakers coming from Sudan, Nepal, or Zimbabwe in this specific case this year. So this webinar is basically the initial period or initial process towards that event in June in Peru, Lima. So today in this webinar, we have the pleasure to count with 3 very, very top level speakers. The first one being Rafael Escobar, who has been working in the past with Practical Action for many years. We also count with Javier, who is working for the Inter-American Development Bank. And we also have Byron, who is working for OLADE. I'm going to very quickly present them, the 3 of them, before I give the word to my first speaker, who is going to be Rafael, who is going to talk about the experience of Practical Action for over the last 4 or 5 years. The webinar is going to be running in English entirely, as we are also inviting colleagues within Practical Action and external audience from over the different continents, including Africa and Asia, as we thought it'd be great to actually count with and disseminate the experiences that have successfully been rolled out in Latin America across different continents. So my first speaker today is Rafael Escobar, who is a sociologist with 25 years of experience in the field of renewable energies, water and sanitation, and capacity building. He's very well known for his work in territorial energy planning, design, implementation, and management of energy systems for both lighting and cooking, and also productive uses of energy. He has worked for, as I said before, for Practical Action as the energy infrastructure and basic services for many years as the manager in the Latin American region, and he's now consultant working as consultant for very different bodies, including the ICA in Peru, but also nevertheless other institutions in the region. We're also going to have Bjorn Chilikinga. Sorry, he's a chemical engineer by the Central University of Ecuador, specialist in renewable energies. He's been working in the promotion and implementation of renewable energy projects since 1980, so a long time ago. And he's been spanning a lot of experience in this field. First with Central University of Ecuador, and then with OLADE, the Regional Energy Institution in Latin America. From 2012 to 2018, he's been managing a bilateral relationship between Olade and the Canadian government in a program under which energy access um, took place and specific active uses of energy in the Latin American and Caribbean region. So Byron is gonna come, Rafael, and he's gonna talk about his he's gonna talk about his experience in the space of productive uses, following the presentation of Rafael. So basically, adding is adding on what Rafael is going to tell us, and then finally. We have Javier Cuervo with us today as well. He is an electrical engineer by the University of Los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. He's been where he also got the um, Bachelor of Economy, the master degree in economics, sorry, at the same university, and then also on resource economics from the University of Maryland in College Park. He's been working for the Inter-American Development Bank for 19 years now in several areas, including energy, natural resource management, and climate change. Prior to the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, he worked for the government of Colombia at the National Planning Department for a utility, for the government-owned utility. So Javier has been working on topics related to reform, transmission and distribution, solar utility scale, rural electrification, hydrogeneration, and modernization of utilities. So he spans a terrible amount of experience. He's currently managing and coordinating the relationship with the SE for All, the Sustainable Energy for All initiative and framework, and providing supervision of energy projects in Suriname that include rural electrification and the upgrade of grid infrastructure. He also has experience working in Guatemala, Mexico, Colombia, El Salvador, Honduras, among other experiences and geographical areas. And so those, and he has, sorry, also be co-leading projects by the IDB, by the Inter-American Development Bank board for more than $1.5 billion in the last 10 years. So I think we have three really good panelists today with spanning a lot of experience on rural electrification, planning, etc. And we're going to have a huge amount of information today. So I really hope the audience can enjoy the discussion today. Conversations or questions from the audience, please submit them in the chat, as we will have about 10 to 15 minutes by the end of the webinar to respond some of them, and hopefully we can have some stimulating questions from you. Looking forward to receive them. And I think I'm more or less ready to give the word to Rafael, who is going to talk in Spanish, but we have a translation happening. So Daniel, who is the translator, is going to provide us with translation from Spanish to English. And I think, Rafael, yours is the space. You can come in and start your presentation. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the institution coordinating this webinar, Practical Action. I really think that this initiative is quite correct considering the situation we are on in the world. Because we are trying to aim at the poverty reduction and its relation to energy. I also would like to say hello to Byron and Javier. With Byron, we have been friends for many, many years, so a big hug to you. Let's start with the exposition then. Today I will address 4 topics. One is related to the analysis and explanation of the evolution of the production use for Practical Action Office. And also how practical action in productive uses of energy was able to add some changes and changes of strategy according to the projects that it has had. Then I will address our experience in productive uses, some key factors of this as well. And then we will present brief information that could shed some light, maybe some study cases that we have done in zones like Cajamarca and Cusco. I will finally learn some lessons learned and conclusions that are trying to strengthen these experiences and, of course, improve the interventions in the future. First, here in Practical Action Office and during the experience on the field of the productive uses of energy, it is important to say that from the first project that we started to implement in practical action, and the concept of productive use has always been there, has always been present. However, when we see the evolution of that concept, our work strategy, our intervention models have dealt with three concepts that you see here. And actually, the first projects that were done in Latin America from the Practical Action Office, we started to use energy from the mechanic point of view. I mean, the mechanic action in order to ignite some machine, to start a machine. And then we created some developments, as you will see in the project, in the fund of promotion of micro power stations. We changed the concept from this concept, the productive use of electricity, and it will focus this towards the users. And therefore, we were able to evaluate the limitations and assess the limitations that this model has of seeing this rural electrification project. And finally, of course, we use the application of intervention model with a much broader concept of the productive use of energy that has been refined over the years. Of course, one of the fundamental things that include this experience in productive use of energy has been the great worry for not only provide the service or provide the connection, let's say, but also fundamentally we were seeking this concept, which is, and I mean by this, the sustainability of a power service, of a system that it can be sustainable in the rural area. And of course, towards that sustainability, the Practical Action Office has been adapting the intervention models to these concepts. So this third concept is the one that just guided our experience for many, many work years. So let's see what was our experience and what are the approaches, perspectives that we applied to during this work process and this use of productive use of energy. Maybe if a colleague from Practical Action can take a look at this presentation, may say that there are many, many more approaches that were applied. And probably, yes, that might be true. But I think there are three approaches, three perspectives that I think we described in the in the references that we shared with you. There are three key approaches that were developed by this office during our work. The first deals with the demand approach, and that has to do with the fact that in Latin America, and especially in Peru, and I wouldn't be afraid to say in many parts of the world as well, we have worked with the demand, the offer approach, meaning that we have been quite intense, quite persistent from the government, especially in the development and the increase of electric power coverage. That means basically getting those connections going, setting up connections. But us in this demand approach, we have a starting point. The particularity that has this demand, this type of demand in each of the human groups, whether they are users, whether it's an association, whether it's a larger group. So in these priorities or needs of the groups, we include services. And of course, we look at the market as well. Now, soon I will share an experience that we had with a group of people, and that gave several lessons towards our work, and it's good to consider in the future. This demand approach for us was key for our work. And that is where we create some differences with other interventions that were done in Latin America over the years and in the world as well. The other approach, which is quite important for our intervention of foreign experiences, has been the communicative approach. And we start with this approach because the information is power in the rural area. And as a consequence, when that information is only handled by the politicians or only those technicians and some leaders, that information actually does not arrive to the mass of populations that actually we want to reach. So the proposal of this approach, the goal of this approach is to massify communication using different communication channels. That means that our proposal for this productive use of energy is that we do not expect energy by itself to generate development. Instead, we need to foster and motivate communication to all sectors so they can know about all the information and possibilities that electricity and power provides. The third approach that I think it was critical for our work was the systemic approach. We cannot develop, that was the analysis done by the technical team in Practical Ocean here in Latin America, we cannot promote a project or a program of rural electrification if there's no clear concept of articulation among actors. Not only key actors, but all actors that are in a way related to the energy chain. So this systemic approach was quite useful, was very useful to develop relations and communications inside the communities in order to provide the experiences that we have actually encouraged. Now, practical action in Latin America has had two great experiences that were established using this productive use. The first experience that we had started in 2001, 2002, I guess. And it was an application of a promotion fund for micro power system. And this program, this experience with micro power stations, and in the last years we also applied solar panels as well. These experiences have been quite valuable because it allowed the identification of key factors that are related to the productive use and not only with the delivery of energy just for lighting purposes. It also allowed us to find limitations that we face since this project is developed in isolated locations where there are no many communication channels and the relations with the market are quite limited as well, and where evidently the communications factor also has some limitations. The other experience that we had is quite general, quite wider, that was done in the last 10 years, and it actually deals with the development of some work in some areas where we had electric power connections, electrified areas, and that were part of the electric concessions handled by the country, which are managed by the power companies, electricity companies. This experience also allowed us to find some key elements that I will mention as general lessons at the end of my presentation. Let's see the first main point that we worked on. As I mentioned, the rural electrification project through renewable energy, where we encourage the setting up of many power stations, 72, has been for us quite valuable because the main objective of this project was to implement a financial model for power isolated generation systems in areas that were not connected. And of course, the owning of the management system so that system could be sustainable. This project was developed since 92 up to 2008, and it was financed by the Inter-American Development Bank during this time. This project had an intervention model that was quite interesting. And the first element of the intervention model, or that model, was promotion and communication. So that work of motion and communication was quite important because Peru, in particular, had around 35% of rural electrification in those years. So we needed to develop a promotion process to many communities in order to identify those communities that were located farther away and that would have the natural resources in order to develop the hydropower zones, power plants. And this intervention model was, the technical assistance was key. That was important, but parallelly, the project developed some process that allowed to have a trained staff, trained personnel, not only in the technical field, but also administrative and in the management of those projects. With that project, we developed a knowledge transfer processes that included the training of small companies that will provide equipment for micro hydroelectrical power stations. A key factor was also the organization and the training. And here we learn as part of our work is that the organizations that we had regarding the management models were based on municipalities or communities. But almost all of them had a large, quite critical problem. They didn't have legal organizational support. Therefore, it became vulnerable spaces for politicians. And the second aspect is that they didn't consider a cost for the service. That would be some sort of like analysis for the system vulnerability. A fourth fundamental aspect was recovery of credit, because this project included the delivery of some credits, those that were done in organizations, production associations, but fundamentally municipalities, those that were committed to communities in order to give back the credit that was given. So in this experience, over 10-year experience, we had these criteria for management and of the productive use of energy. These criteria for management were essential because we want to provide support, of course, and we want to provide a high quality service. However, this cannot entail, this electric system do not have these three aspects. Now, first, the management. We found that from this evaluation of different management models, we need to create a commutative company was the most suitable. This allowed for a community company to become a juridical person that was recognized by the national regulations, national laws, and in a way that helped as a fundamental element in order to keep the service. considering that municipalities, in many times, they wanted to destroy this organization, and since it is a juridical entity, it has then some legal elements that will be able to defend it. A second element is the rate scheme. And here I would like to highlight the importance of productive use of energy for this scheme. We develop a rate per block, and the first block is the one paid by everybody, the whole community. This allowed us to support and ensure in a way that to pay the minimal cost that entailed having the service. And then the second block is the one that was constructed that due to differences in allowed us to differentiate the consumptions and the initiatives of small businesses. The third block was, of course, oriented to the productive use. And that third block had a fundamental aspect, which was to promote the productive use of electricity, meaning that we didn't apply here as common sense would say that the one that consumes more, has to pay more. Now, the third block, since it was a promotional block, we had the cheap cost for kilowatts, considering as long as this company needed to pay the first, the second, and the third block. So that was quite helpful because that allowed us not to punish this company because were not large companies, and actually it had a quite great impact between the people that consumed a lot of kilowatts and not people that consumed that many kilowatts. And training. They were not training courses, they were training programs. So we have some pictures that we can show you of the diversity of the productive uses. But here, before closing this part, we could say that this project was pioneer at the national level and introduced the productive use practice in the rural electrification process. We say that the important impact of production happened at the small companies ruled by families, and we identified that the change that we had and improvements of economy could arrive to 26 and 30 of the improvement of income. Of course, the most intense productive uses were seen in carpenter's workshop, for metal and for work, not necessarily in small family-owned businesses. And a lesson that we had from this project is that many dynamics of the productive uses are determined by the market, and that we know that. And since they were isolated systems, and since the communities were quite far from the center or the main town, in a way it caused that the lack of development of many of those chains, since they didn't have a market nearby or the factors in order to have a great competition. In the case of Cajamarca, we had a system that were covered with electrification rural programs. And this is a case where the Japanese corporations was able to, during a year, to support this program of the increase of the electrical frontier that was also worked with the government. This last two experiences that we'll explain start with one fundamental aspect, which is the evidence on the evaluation that is done on the rural electrification projects in the country. Are first we can find that the electricity or the power didn't have a quite strong impact on poverty reduction. And the second aspect is that this power was delivered through conventional power networks, power connections. It was only used, or in great majority, was used in order to change the bulb, let's say, by another one, meaning that we changed only lighting, the quality of the lighting. So those two analysis factors worried the government, because since those systems were delivered to electrical power companies, those companies also expressed a problem, meaning that their profitability was being affected, since consumptions were quite low. So this project was developed from 2010, 2011, and it had impact in 360 localities in Cajamarca. And of course, the total, as I mentioned, was, if it contributed, it helped the situation of many villagers. So the project aimed at implementing a raising awareness project, so that users can improve their consumption, electricity consumption. The problem that we saw was that electricity didn't contribute, and that led to electricity consumptions generated as well problems in the system in general, and especially generated quite critical projects in the operations and maintenance of the system. As you can see here, the strategy that we had in the project was using one of the approaches that we saw just a few minutes ago, which is to identify the users, the different type of users, and provide to each of those users, or apply a different strategy to each of those users. And I will talk about two representative users. The users of less than 25 kilowatts consumption, that was the most of the people in the system, and the local companies. And actually, this first sector, for households, we had the large amount of the population that considered the nature and consumption didn't consume much more than that 25 and only use electricity power for lighting purposes. So in this sector of the population, we needed a communication process to develop productivity activities, and faced to the companies, we needed the more technical assistance in order to engine fuel powered engines by electrical ones. So this technical assistance contributed for each sector was key in order to have success in the project. So we have this particularity that this intervention model had is the segmentation of families, the development of several service models, since raising awareness and the use of the productive use, and the promotion of the productive uses through training, technical assistance, and the use of systems that could show in order to raise awareness population in order to better use electricity. As I mentioned before, this strategy was quite important, and in this chart as consumption by type of connection, the importance that it had in terms of consumptions, the number of connections between the first sector in the families and the companies. As you can see, the difference in terms of use of energy was quite strong. There were quite strong difference. However, we needed to work in each of these sectors in order to foster consumption. As the last case, it has the same logic, but it is a project that was financed by the Ministry of Energy and the World Bank. As the previous case, we worked in Cusco, and we had the one goal, which was to increase the income of producers. And here we found an element that is quite important, which is that producers, besides using electricity for productive uses, they needed some sort of a guide to orient their business to attractive markets. So we started to develop business plans that could help the producer not only to produce more, but better, and place them in a market. We also looked at increasing sales as part of this development of a business plan. And of course, we wanted to design a effective methodology that would allow to duplicate this project in some other areas. So let's see the actors. And here is where we start working with local and regional governments. This was quite important for the project because in a way we had these actors, these government state actors, in seeking for a more sustainable aspect of this initiative. So in this work, we had different actors that were producers. We also worked with cooperatives and small local companies. And in this project, we also started to working with the financial aspect. We started to have relations with local financial entities that supported initiatives. And we also contacted machinery manufacturers that were providers that sometimes were invisible in this organization for rural electrification, but it was actually necessary to include them in a more so because this work can be more comprehensive. You can see here the accomplishments of the project. we achieved many things as to increase in the electrical consumption and fundamentally in the productive activities, and that created a sustainable increase that even reached 35–40% of the improvement depending on the production activity of those rural producers. I finally want to mention some lessons in our work. But before that, I wanted to mention two fundamental aspects. I think that in these last years, it's quite clear that electrification is quite important, but actually it doesn't actually generate a good development by itself. Productive uses of energy do not develop naturally or spontaneously. They need support. In line with that logic, the options that we have, we can describe them as such. So it is necessary for all projects to identify the target population, and it's also fundamental to have a baseline, a good baseline, because if we do not do a good job, we cannot segment the population, and we cannot provide the support, whether they're technical, management, production, financial support, according to the needs. Sometimes we just create a unique strategy, and this doesn't actually allow to develop this initiative. Establish and prioritize. To establish and give priority to the productive potential is key as well, since it allows to identify the main characteristics of activities and the potential productive chains. And of course, this allows to see current priorities. We should also consider, or as part of our lessons, the fact that we need to respond to demand, electrical demand that were identified. And it's important to help this demand and the most relevant aspects and the needs according to power. We also need to implement a communication and constant communication strategy, as it was mentioned here, which will go with the raising awareness process that is done for the development of productive uses of energy, and that is key. And from our experience, we have seen that it was fundamental to develop these communication plans that has to go with the raising awareness plans. Two final aspects: we need to make sure the sustainability of this institution, and that is something that it worries me, especially because besides we create some strategic alliances, we can see it is evident that up to date, especially in countries as Peru, Bolivia, and some other Latin American countries where I worked, there is still some sectors, this sector of energy, agriculture, production sectors, still work parallelly. They do not have some sort of bridges to develop a project, a productive project that improves the productivity in the country. This institutional aspect is fundamental, because if we do not do this, probably the pilot project development will just remain as projects. And of course, it is also important to develop a permanent learning process from monitoring and feedback provision. In Peru and Latin America, considering the electrification coefficients that we had, we are facing a project that was called in the population in the last mile, which is the population that's located the farthest, is the poorest, and we need to develop to gather these experiences, discuss about them, and see what we can improve in the future. That's it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thanks a lot, Rafael and Daniel, for the translation. It's been really, really interesting. I'm aware that we are a little bit late to our original schedule, but it's been really interesting to hear the broad experience from practical action in Peru and the Latin American region, specifically on the space of the productive use of energy, not something that is isolated under practical action for the Latin American region, but nevertheless something that we are constantly testing in different regions, including South Sahel Africa and South Asia at the moment. And I just keep those three approaches that Rafael was talking about in the beginning, the demand, communication, and systemic approaches as key for the activities forward. I think that's really a good way to approach the systemic problem that we find in rural areas where demand is usually lower than the required for the sustainability, financial sustainability of models installed. And this is not just a problem that we've seen in the Latin American region, but nevertheless a problem that is also constantly coming up in South Sahel Africa, in many other rural areas across the globe, even in the north as well, in some specific areas. I also like the want to flag up the fact that productive uses of energy is not organically going to happen unless there is some sort of facilitation or mentoring process behind. And we've seen that not just in the programs in the Latin American region, but in many different processes and in initiatives that we've been working with, and therefore the relevance of providing those trainings and capacity building, but also the ability for the end users to like come up with tools and methodologies that allow them to really utilize energy in a transformative way. And finally, the multilateral approach, I agree, is a great point. Sorry, hopefully you can hear me now. I was dropped just for 30 seconds. So I'm gonna, because of, or for the sake of the time, I'm gonna open up the floor for our two other presenters or panelists today. We have Byron and Javier. Maybe Byron, could you please comment on Rafael's presentation, provide your very long and great experience on the space, including other experiences that you may have had in the productive use of energy. And so after your presentation and Javier's presentations, we can open up the floor for additional questions from the audience. For everybody, please make sure your questions are in the chat. There will be some space in the end of the webinar for replying to those. So Byron, please, the floor is yours now for your comments and inputs.
I would like to know if my microphone is working very well. Just give me some sign that everything is fine with my macro. If everything is correct, I would like to congratulations to organizers and my congratulations to a practical action because they have been working with this productive uses methodology since a lot of years, And in fact, this institution give us to the Latin American Energy Organization a good feedback to deliver to establish a sustainable energy methodology for rural area. I would like to emphasize some of the concepts that my colleague, Mr. Escobar, highlighted. I think some of them are very critical in rural areas. And he mentioned it, for instance, the concept of productive uses and how it relates with electricity service. And the demand side orientation, I think it is a key element when we are trying to support some isolated community. If we do not see what the community is trying to achieve, we can go as a technician or as an external organization to a community with any recipe. We need to see what is the demand of this community, and that is what Rafael highlighted at the beginning of his presentation. This is quite important. Another important point that Rafael mentioned is how the small hydropower project established in terms of financial orientation, how the project achieved the financial resources of IDB to allocate funds for each one of the SHP projects in the Andean region of Peru. I think this approach was very, very important because they started to introduce in the rural population the concept of how to manage a loan from a bank entity. And it is obviously one important issue for providing electricity to rural areas. So this is the second point that I would like to highlight, how this project teaches us how to involve a bank entity into those kind of projects. Another point that I would like to highlight is how the Cajamarca project involve all the concepts of awareness to the population. That is another critical issue, because if we do not involve all the stakeholders in the main activities of a project, we will not have successful. So an awareness campaign, it's very important, and I would like to highlight this point of this Cajamarca experience. Obviously, there are many other issues of this project, but I would like to highlight this, the awareness one. In the case of the Cusco, I think the main issue that was involved was how to financial resources are oriented to community needs, family needs, or a small business, and this is a very good approach that practical solutions have had in this Cusco project. Using these examples as an introduction, I would like to tell that OLADE, the Latin American Energy Organization, designed its own sustainable methodology approach. And this sustainable methodology approach was based in this ITV experience of practical solutions, because we use several key points in this sustainability that matches completely with what Mr. Escobar was explaining us. And the first one is the community participation. This is the first issue that we must have very careful when we approach a community. We need the commitment of the community to participate since the beginning of one initiative. The other point that was highlighted by Mr. Escobar and that we took for the OLADE sustainability is the capacity building. It is a critical point because we should train the community since the beginning of one initiative, because they should be involved since the design of one demonstrative project. Another important issue that was mentioned and that we took from this is the productive activity. Normally, an isolated community do not have financial resources to establish any kind of productive project. So we need to see how the international cooperation or the government could allocate a seed fund in order that community have some financial funds to buy especially the hard equipment that will solve their needs. So this financial approach is very important in this methodology because we need to show the people how using seed funds they could start their own business in the business of the community. Another point very important is that the project that is going to start should generate some incomes, and the incomes will serve to establish a rural enterprise into the community. This rural enterprise will be dealing since the design of the project, going through the implementation, the operation, and recovering all the
Yeah, Byron, I think we've lost your voice or your connection. Can you still hear us? Okay, so it seems like Byron has lost his connection to the webinar. Just just in the middle of his presentation or his the points he's talking about. I'm gonna pass to Javier now. Hopefully you are in the line. Just with jumping from some of the points that that Byron was highlighting before, it'd be great as you're representing a regional institution, a multilateral development bank that is and has been working historically in this space. It'd be in addition to your inputs, in addition to your ideas and comments, it'd be great to hear from you um, on what's the role of such an entity like the Inter-American Development Bank to finally end energy poverty in the region, in Peru and other countries, especially in that very last mile and the farthest behind, the ones we were talking about, the people who are really, really isolated. And in special, take into consideration the context in Latin America is very different from the context in Africa, where in the case of Africa, there are like vast areas with rural and served communities where private sector company is thriving at the moment, specifically in Eastern Africa. So taking into consideration the context of Central and the Andean areas in Latin America. How and what's the role of the Inter-American Development Bank to solve that last mile gap that we are seeing? Thank you, Javier. Yours is the floor.
Yes, hello, good morning to everybody. Thank you for the introduction. I would like to start by please asking Elena to confirm by chat whether you can hear me well. I'm looking at the chat, so you can confirm you're hearing me well. That I appreciate that. I would like to give my thanks to Practical Action for organizing this webinar. It's a very interesting and very important discussion, and this is at the heart of the interest of the American Development Bank as an organization that is working with our 26 member countries to achieve universal access following the principles or the goals set in the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. Now, and also my thanks to my fellow speakers for the presentation, to Rafael, the presentation and Byron, the remarks that he was making. I would like to clarify, I will not make a presentation per se. I am going to make a couple of comments based on what was discussed. And yes, putting into the context, as Carlos was suggesting, into the context of the situation of Latin America and the Caribbean. I understand that we have participants from several parts of the world, so it's probably a good idea just to very briefly tell them that in Latin America, we have roughly 19, 20 million people without access. So the rates of electricity access in general in the countries are very high, but we have important disparities between rural access and urban access. The big exception, because it has a very low level of electricity countrywide, is Haiti. Haiti is still something that is a debt that I think that as a region we still have with that country in order to help them improve electricity access. Haiti, the electricity access in the last Olare, 37 or 38, the Olare statistics. The rest of the countries, as I mentioned, I mean, we can say that 7 other countries, and if you add 88 countries, are responsible for more than 80% of the population without access. And as Carlos was mentioning, the critical issue in Latin America is what is being considered the last mile access. And that last mile access is very important because even in countries such as Mexico or Brazil that have a very high level of electricity access, just that less than 1% of people without access can easily represent more than 1 million people, in addition to those without access in the countries that I just mentioned. So in Latin America, that's the situation. Now, I think that the presentation that Rafael made is very timely in pointing some of the elements that I think coincide a lot with what we have seen at the IDB, kind of like as a ways to proceed to bring electricity to this last mile. In Latin America, we have basically found that, like there is like a well-planned and especially carefully targeted rural electrification programs, then the countries can achieve a lot in terms of increasing the access, especially in the rural populations. And I think that the examples that were brought to our attention today are very useful. The examples of Peru. Peru is one of the countries that in the last 10, 15 years have dramatically increased the rate of electricity in the rural areas. And I think that the presentation was very good also in showing us some of the elements. I know that the discussion is basically given, or the objective of the seminar is mainly targeting the concept of the productive uses. But I would like to say that one of the things that he mentioned is really, really important, which is at the very conceptual level, that definition, that change in the understanding of what we consider the productive uses. Because I think that from several years ago, the idea of a productive uses was just basically to look at what we will bring in terms of income to the families. That was not necessarily the best guidance to establish how to work with projects. Because as it was pointed by Rafael, and this is something that the bank has also studied, and we have a couple of publications, and in particular, we produced one last year with which is about how to really measure what are the economic benefits of rural electrification. And that basically has the idea behind of that the use of electricity, yes, it does have productive uses that will increase what will be the income, but it goes beyond that because it goes, and I think that some of the photos that were presented show that what it achieves in terms of education with the family, in terms of having more time for the kids to dedicate to education, when they have illumination, when they have adequate lighting at home. So the savings in time when you do not have for many issues to go and collect resources from other places because you can achieve many of the things that you need to do. Or time being saved because, for example, now instead of having to do everything by hand, you can have something as simple as an electrical mixer to prepare bakery and things like that. So I think that this is important because that basically encompasses the idea that when we look at the productive uses of electricity, we indeed need to understand that the concept goes beyond just what is the income. And I think that is important because when you understand that, then you understand that, like scaling up these rural electrification projects, especially scaling rural electrification projects in isolated communities that are usually the subject of these last mile projects, is not a one-dimensional task. I mean, and not only it's not a one-dimensional task, but there are no prescriptions. I mean, I think that what is one of the lessons that it's important even to notice is that in the two examples that we saw, there are differences. And you need several actors to participate in the formulation and in the implementation of these kind of projects. I will kind of like borrowing an analysis of a publication that the IDB and UNDP did last year about the challenges of bringing rural electricity to that last mile. That publication that you can all find in Google is called Meeting Challenges while Measuring Progress and Benefits of Sustainable Energy Access in Latin America. We have identified that there are three sets of factors, and I think that the presentation by Practical Action showed us the importance of one of those actors. So the kind of like the three actors that are very important and that we have seen that are very important to have are the first set will be kind of like institutions that to manage the energy fund. And this is related to one of the concepts that Byron was mentioning and that Carlos also touched upon, which is the importance of having organizations that adequately manage the energy funds. Because, for example, even we as the IDB, even if we provide funding for rural electrification, we do not have the capability to actually go at the level of the community or of the households. There need to be channels by which these funds are combined with funds from other sources, national governments, in order to reach very clear and targeted rural electrification programs. So I think that that's one set of factors which is important, the importance of having these kind of mechanisms to channel resources, energy funds, or it can be in some other cases working directly with energy companies, with utilities. In the case of Guatemala, for example, early last decade, as part of the privatization of the distribution in Guatemala, there were goals that were part of the agreements in this privatization of the distribution companies by which they needed to increase access in rural areas. But there was still a mechanism by which the government would be recognizing the cost of connections. So, but therefore you have like a trust fund able to manage those funds. A second set of factors, which is very important, and I think that this presentation showed us the importance of the value that they do, are precisely what could be microfinance institutions and organizations like NGOs or other type of communities that play a very important role in terms of analyzing what is the real demand, analyzing the real demand and organizing them, identifying what are the segments of consumptions that will need to be met by these kind of projects to provide training, to provide capability to the community that will be receiving the electricity, customer support, and in some cases, many of these organizations are even involved in the actual collection, for example, of low payments when there is some kind of microfinancing provided to the organizations. This is a point that I think Carlos just made, and we found it very, very important. They need to also find a way by which the consumers, I mean the households, for the communities not only need to have the capabilities to identify what would be like their business plans in order to take the most of what they can do regarding rural electricity, but also that they will find sources of funding. So that's another role that these organizations can play. And a third set of factors, which sometimes is not very, it's not very well commented or is not mentioned a lot, but it is important, is that at the end, remember that all of these activities will require also suppliers. So we're talking about, like even if we're not talking about big retailers, there has to be a system in place by which equipment can be bought, by which technical service can be provided. So there's also a need, and it's also important that when these projects take place, that there is also participation by those retailers that will be at the end providing the equipment that is precisely the equipment that will be used. I mean, one of the examples I just mentioned is one of the projects that we have in Suriname. Like some of the issues that became really, really important was that some of the women in an indigenous community, a lot of the handcraft that they will do, they will be sewing by hand. So because of clearly the limitations of doing everything by hand, the amount of production that they would be able to achieve every day was limited. Once they had reliable access to electricity, many of these women dedicated to this handcraft were able to buy an electrical sewing machine, and clearly that increased notably their production. But therefore, you needed retailers willing to go to these communities and provide the kind of services that is needed, reparations, technical support, etc. So um, I think at this moment I'm going to leave it at that, because I know that we're probably going to have a lot of time, or plenty of time for questions. And I am all ears. And again, thanks for the opportunity to participate in this.
Thanks a lot, Javier. Those are really important points. I really like you highlighting the need for support to the suppliers. At Practical Action, we usually call it the market activation approach, which is basically activating markets that don't that organically are not going to happen, are not going to work, and they require stimulate like credit and finance stimulation at both sides, end user side, but also supplier side. In a sense, helping companies and helping suppliers and retailers come into spaces that otherwise they wouldn't, because they will find it very risky, right? So the supply side of things interrelates with the demand side of things, which is what Rafael was talking about, the need for awareness raising, the need for people to know what products to consume, the quality standards, etc. And those supply versus demand have to be coexisting together under what we call the policy and regulation framework, which entitles and helps the decentralized renewable energy to evolve in those areas, but also the finance. What sort of finance are we talking about, and not just increasing the amount of finance, but also increasing the blending of the finance, right? The different options that either both end users but also suppliers have to access in order to increase and grow their business models and their opportunities. So that's a really good point. I know, Byron, you're back, and your voice was cut down all of a sudden. So I don't know if you have any last comment before we open up discussion and for a couple of questions. So yours is the floor, but really be brief and bring us the last comments and inputs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and excuse me, but it was some problem of the network. What I would like to say to conclude is that Olade, using this sustainability methodology, deliver many projects in Guatemala, Guyana, Bolivia, and Paraguay, and we got very successful results. Many of these rural enterprises that we established in each one of the communities have excellent results, and using the seed capital that we assign to those communities with the support of the Canada government that give OLADE some funds to improve the conditions of life of rural communities. We introduce this criteria of rural enterprises in the communities, and they are doing their own business because they use this the own incomes that they got from the productive projects to do many other initiatives in the communities. So this sustainability concept is very important because communities have the chance to start their own initiatives, but of course they need some seed capital to start actions. So I would like to congratulate all the experience of Peru and the IDB because I think it has a good space in rural communities using productive focus of the energy to grow all the priorities that rural communities has. So thank you very much. I'm sorry again for this interruption, but we are available for any direct question or whatever you would like to know from the OLAD experience.
Thanks a lot, Byron. And thanks for the excellent points that you did before and now. Now that we've been listening to the panelists and to Rafael as a speaker in the beginning and his presentation, we've been receiving a couple of questions. I also have a question for the three of you that we can start the debate or the discussion. I mean, it's going to be brief because the time is quite delayed, right, based on our initial expectation. But nevertheless, we would like to throw a couple of questions to the speakers. There's been a question around capacity building and trying to nail down what kind of capacity building was provided during the implementation of the programs in Peru. And see whether those were targeting utilities, administrators, or local authorities or leaders of the communities, and which ones did have more impact. And then I would like to bring another question from my own question, and reflecting on a reality that we found out in South Sahel Africa, but I think it is similar to what is happening in Latin America. We were invited like a year ago. We were invited by the Club ER, which is it's a club forum composed by a number of utilities across South Sahel Africa to give or provide a training on productive use of energy. And then the first question we did to the utilities Sorry again, something's happening today with the internet. So what I was about to say is we were invited by the club here in South Sahel Africa, and most of the utilities and most of the managers out of national utilities who came to the training, about 20 of them, didn't know much about productive use of energy. They did know about the concept, but they didn't integrate the approach into any of their portfolio of work. I still remember, and Rafael, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember in the work that we did in Latin America, there was an excellent question to the utilities in Peru, and then if I remember well, the question was, as a utility, do you want to increase your income? And of course, most, in the rural communities, in the rural grid extension communities, communities covered by the grid, in the very poor, very rural areas. And most of the, all the utilities said, yes, we want, right? We want to increase the income because that really ensures sustainability, right? But there was another question on would you integrate productive uses? Would you integrate this approach as part of your current approach and mechanism to increase income? Well, that part of the income wasn't part of the question, but very few of them prioritize productive use of energy as an income revenue for achieving sustainability. So I think this is still we're still far from like an integration of productive uses. And as Javier very wisely said, productive uses has been evolving as a concept, right, over the last 3 to 4 years, and it's much more complex and it's much more multi-sectoral at the moment as we usually talk about it, and it integrates it with agriculture, with cool chains, heating chains, etc. So there's a lot of things involved in that. Is much more complex than households, lighting systems, for instance. But still, we are far from seeing utilities integrating that approach into their activities and current priorities. So I would like to know from the speakers, what is it we have to do for utilities to take it seriously in the context of Latin America? What recommendations do you have for countries in Africa? So I don't know who can reply to these questions first. I guess, Rafael, you're best placed for the first one, and then Byron and Javier, you can jump in whenever you please.
Yes, it's quite complex. We should compare it with the following aspects, I think. Governments and all key actors that are in the energy sector, production sector, the business sector is vital for them and to develop work, intersectoral bridges for work. Because if we do not do that, we will continue to be condemned to having just rural electrification just for lighting purposes. That is the general context. Regarding some specific things, the experience tells us that many of the countries arrived to electrification coefficient that was kind of fabulous. That is the case of Peru, for example. Rural electrification is almost 90%. But if we look in the inside and we look in detail, populations is consuming 12 kilowatts per month, and only they are using it for lighting purposes. And even so, they use some lamps, gas lamps sometimes. So what have we done there? We haven't done anything. But there has been some changes in statistics. And basically, for me, it is political criteria that we implemented, meaning that statistics are there and the number of connections is king and the most important thing. So here it is fundamental, it is essential that in the design of a projects or programs for accessing energy or power, we shouldn't prioritize the access to number without previously analyzing the opportunity for implementing a economic business or economic opportunity. So from that, we can design training programs that would include a technical aspect, management aspect as well, and the production aspect. So in that design of things, that conception of things, I do agree with Javier that there's a fundamental aspect, and that is defined by providers, by suppliers. I didn't say something before in my position, something that was fundamental. We actually foster court projects for productive uses of energy, yes, but producers or providers didn't know each other. And there are many suppliers and providers for technology, services, etc. So the role that the technology or services providers have, it's essential, it's crucial. And I think that, in a nutshell, is what should be encouraged, not only for the last mile, but also we need to see now these great percentages for coverage for those families in order not to have poor people with energy or electricity. So we have to leave that vicious cycle.
Thanks a lot, Rafael. Byron or Javier, any comment or input from your side?
Yes, this is Javier. Yes, I couple of questions. With regard to the capacity building, it was like the first question. I think that we have to identify that but under capacity building, we have different needs at different levels. Uh, because one is the level actually when you also need to involve kind of like the utilities or even the government agencies. In some cases, this has to do about bringing the concept and the benefits of new technology, like how much things have evolved worldwide regarding mini grids, rural PV, the reduction in cost. They need to do adequate planning, so working with the agencies and with the government in the formulation of a good planning so that you have a master plan to achieve universal access, and then you can, once you have that and once you have identified very clearly what are your lines of work at the strategic level, then you indeed turn that into specific actions and specific ideas, whether you're going to be doing concessions, whether you're going to be, like working with different mechanisms or something like that. So we have that level of capacity, and we have found that that's still needed, like that's still needed. It is very important. And for that, obviously, the structure of the counterpart is also very important. As I mentioned before, the need to have an agency that basically acts as a champion about reaching universal access and that has that as basically the only objective in part of the work plan. That is very important. And then we also have now, when you do projects at the very project level, of course, there is a lot of capacity building that in some cases, that goes hand in hand even with the consultation processes. Like because even if we're talking about projects that have a lot of benefit regarding rural electrification and bringing electricity and communities understand them very well, you still need to do consultation processes to involve the communities and to have them be participants of the solution. So I think that in some cases, and we have found some good examples in which the capacity goes in hand into the consultation process by which we make the communities lot more participant of the project that we are doing, and that brings benefits. So at that level, it is also important to have the capacity. Now, regarding the very valid point that you brought about utilities, yes, I agree. I think that's the case. I mean, we still, we have to interact a lot with utilities for several reasons, not only because we engage in energy action, but you may imagine that we also engage in, like more traditional kind of projects and reform projects and things like that. And it is true that what we have found is that depending the type of utility and depending also on how come that these utilities are responsible for these activities of electricity access, they may engage in this discussion or in this promotion about the productive use of electricity in rural electrification at different levels. I mean, what do I mean by that? I mean by that that in some cases the utilities are yes are interested in facilitating the dialogue for that market to push up, but not because they are really they. I think that their main motivation even to recognize the benefits of these rural projects and to have communities engaged is also because the sustainability of the project also depends on that. and they are engaged more in continuing when they have these responsibilities to continue to providing that support. But I think that when you're talking about large utilities and that large utilities that they are still responsible, and in some cases we're talking about, I mean, we have concentrated the conversation pretty much in rural electrification of grid, but there are still many places in which you are still, like expanding the grid and expanding it, and it basically becomes a little bit more as a business as usual. But even as a business as usual, the utilities in some cases are in a position of strength when it comes to bringing messages to the communities that are receiving a much better service in terms of like what are the options, the opportunities that they will have with the better service, connection to the grid and things like that. But I have to say that personally, I don't think that we should expect too much in terms of kind of like changing the vision of many of these utilities to have them, like incorporate as one of the crucial elements in their revenues the issue of being involved in the productive uses of electricity. There are some cases, EPM, Empresas Públicas de Medellín, in Colombia, at some point they were heavily involved in helping to finance the acquisition of efficient appliances, and that is very important because it is also, clearly, obviously, it is very different if you're going to be having efficient appliances or efficient equipment versus non-efficient for the demands of the mini grid, even if you're talking about a mini grid. So they also become involved in that sense. But it is more because of the impact that they perceive they can make at that level, and not because it is really becoming like a very significant source of income for them.
Thanks a lot, Javier. The sound was 100% clear. I personally struggle a bit to understand all what you said, but I think I got some of the points. You were talking about important elements such as capacity building around planning and the importance of providing capacity building for consultation and how to consult and engage with communities, etc. You also were talking now about the utilities as agencies. I didn't capture properly what you said in the end, but I guess it is to do with energy efficiency and the utilities being probably not the most important actors at this point to integrate productive uses. I don't know if that's right, but sorry, the connection wasn't really that good, or the sound wasn't really that good, at least with me. And maybe you wanna try again the point on the utilities, the last point, because I think it was quite interesting one, but I unfortunately I didn't really pick it up.
Okay, thank you, Carlos. Can you hear me well now? I hope so.
Yes, yes.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened for. No, the point I was making is that when you talk about utilities, it is true what you said, that utilities by and large do not see the engagement into the productive use of electricity as a source of revenue that they will dedicate a lot of effort. I think that when they participate in these rural electrification projects, they do it more from the point of view of bringing the not only the electricity, obviously, but also kind of like facilitating the creation of these markets. I mean, the identification of the opportunities that can be brought. I was using as an example that in Colombia, Empresas Públicas de Medellín, when they have bring rural electrification projects, they also bring that in hand with information about efficient appliances. And yes, they had even participated in the financing of some of these appliances so that the customers will be using efficient appliances, which are much better even for the functioning of the mini grids or of the grid if it was extended. But they do not see that with the vision of having that as an important source of income. I mean, and I don't see that changing in the near future, in which utilities will be considering the involvement into the rural, into the productive uses of electricity as a significant part of their income. I don't see that happening at a large scale in the region.
Thanks a lot, Javier. It was much clearer now. Thanks for that. Byron, I think you want to give a couple of last points before we start wrapping up the webinar.
Thank you very much. I would like to answer the two main questions that you did. The first one, utilities have not an approach of productive uses. In fact, in Guatemala, we receive very big support from the National Utility of Guatemala, just in terms to financing a small hydropower of 90 kilowatts. And they put some almost the 80% of the funding resources, but they will not involve after in the management of the small hydropower. It goes into our methodology of establish a rural energy enterprise. So, in my point of view, utilities have not much with the concept of productive uses because their core business are other kind of approach. They just request for each one of the users to pay a monthly bill. So productive uses are addressed to isolated communities to improve conditions of life. That is why training of community people is very important. It's a key point of the methodology. Not only in training in the management of the energy systems, more important is the management of the business, how to introduce the concept of a business in a community, how to introduce the organizational aspects of a rural enterprise into a community. That is a key factor of this methodology. And of course, utilities would like that someone else would do their job in zones that they are not going to go because the conditions of transportation, the conditions of the roads to reach those points are very, very poor. So we explained in some of the utilities our methodology, and they allowed us to do directly this approach with the communities. Another good example that I would like to teach you or to present you is that in Guyana, when we made a national workshop to present results of those communities, the Prime Minister, that used to be the Energy Minister too, he said that he would like that this country will use this approach of rural electrification with productive uses based on the involvement of communities directly rather than by utilities, because of the distances of the communities, because the poor access to those communities. So I think this approach of productive uses are more oriented to communities to manage directly through rural enterprises. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Byron. Really interesting case, the one you were talking about. Thank you so much. I think we are already reaching the end of the webinar. I think there have been a lot of different interesting points coming from the three speakers. There's a lot about the need for stimulating the markets in the last mile, increasing awareness raising in or pointing awareness raising into every single one of the programs or efforts. Productive uses is not going to happen organically. It needs further support. It needs further a stimulation on the supply side of things, but also on the demand, as the speakers were talking about before. Markets are important, interlinkages with markets, understanding and providing the support to the entrepreneurs, local entrepreneurs, local rural communities, and rural entrepreneurs is key. It's a key factor for further sustainability. Training and capacity building has been mentioned constantly, not just as the training behind managing the energy generation systems, but nevertheless training for the local population to know how to drive businesses and business models that can help increasing the demand, but also nevertheless, and therefore increasing the sustainability of the generation models, but nevertheless also increasing the livelihoods of the families living in rural communities. I think it was also interesting to hear the role or the absence of a role in many of the rural areas from utilities and the potential role from other actors to ensure sustainability in the long process and in the future in order to end the gap in and the poverty, the energy poverty in those very remote areas of Latin America. I think those are, and there've been, of course, other points around and good level of discussion. I think it's time to wrap up the webinar now, but I really would like to thank the three speakers today, Javier, Byron, and Rafael, for your time, for your presentation. Thank you so much for that, and hopefully we will see you soon in Lima, Peru, on the 11th and 12th of June for the regional event that Practical Action is currently organizing. So thank you so much from outside, and have a lovely day. Cheers.